The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Warren St. John, 2015 winner of the Clarence Cason Award for Distinguished Work in Nonfiction, is the author of two best-selling books, Rammer Jammer, his story of traveling the Southeast with extreme Alabama football fans in their RVs, and Outcasts United, his report on the immigrant boys soccer team in Clarkston, Georgia. St. John also spoke fondly of his experiences in the New York literary community, especially at author George Plimpton's parties, and of his new work with Patch, an online community journalism project. I spoke with Warren St. John in our studio in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Warren, it's nice to see you again.
Don, great to see you again, and great to talk about books with you for the third time, I think.
This event is special and different from the others because you are this year's winner of the Clarence Cason Award for distinguished work in extended narrative nonfiction. And here is the dumbest question in all of journalism. You've won this big prize. How do you feel?
Well, my first reaction was, I guess they've run out of people to give it to. I'm obviously very flattered. I feel like I'd like to think of myself as too young to qualify, but maybe, sadly, that's not the case anymore. But I'm excited, and I have a very strong connection to home, and my readers I think of as being mostly in Alabama, maybe all in Alabama, nowhere else. So it's very, very gratifying.
Well, a lot of the previous winners are people that you know, people whose books you've read, and people,
That's right.
and people you know, some of them
Worked for
rather
some
well.
of them. That's correct.
Oh, really? You worked for who?
Well, Howell Raines
You worked for Howell.
Howard hired me at the New York Times.
Yeah.
Know
And you
Diane
worked with some of these
McWhorter
people too.
very well, and huge fan of hers. So it's and Gay Talese as well, another New Yorker with a Alabama connection.
I'll say.
And so it's quite a very august group.
It is, and once in a while we give it to somebody who's not 75, which is.
I'm glad I'm glad
thing.
that happened this year.
But the books that you've had a long career, newspapers and writing for magazines, online, in print, but the prize comes for the two volumes, the two books, Rammer Jammer and Outcasts United. Now neither one of those books is brand new,
Right.
but I know from talking to you over in different situations that you sort of keep up, especially with I know you keep up with some of the Rammer Jammer RV folk. You hear from them, and what about some of the Fugees?
Yeah, with both of them, there's something that's really, there's an intimacy that develops when you write a book about people. First of all, you spend a lot of time with them. It's not like a newspaper article or a magazine piece where you're sort of in and out. This becomes a big chunk of the writer's life, and since I write about people who, for the most part, haven't been written about before, it's a big deal for them, and it's sometimes a little traumatic. It's traumatic to be written about, described in print, to be quoted in ways you can't take back. And so I try to be empathetic about not just what they're going through as subjects in the story that I'm telling, but after that, what they're going through, being sort of exposed and turned into characters in a way that it may not, I'm not capturing the full range of who they are. I'm capturing these moments, and I'm capturing their role in a certain story. And so it's always a snapshot. It's never fully satisfactory to them. And I try to tell them that that's coming, that's going to be part of this process. And I've learned over time to try to educate and give as many disclaimers about that up front as possible so people don't feel blindsided.
Yeah. So do you hear from them?
Oh, sure. I talked to John Ed Belvin, the famous ticket broker of
Yeah.
Rammer Jammer fame just this week. Stay in touch with Chris and Paula Bice, who were foolish enough to invite me aboard their RV for a few weeks in Rammer Jammer, and particularly close with a Burundian refugee family that I got to know writing Outcasts. Actually, probably stay in touch with the broadest range of players in that book through Facebook, because I see the updates all the time, what they're up to. They're not the cute little kids I was writing about.
The barefoot boys from the Sudan are now on Facebook.
That's right, and not only that, but one of the characters in Outcast, a Liberian refugee named Kanu, every time I see him on Facebook, he's sitting in the cockpit of an airplane because he's in flight school.
Is this a great country or what?
It's amazing.
I mean, that is a story, that these people who arrived, these families who arrived in Clarkston, broke with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing, and some of them have
found lives.
Mostly made it, right?
For the most part, they're complicated stories. I actually got I got a Facebook message this week from one of the players on the team who had decided to go to Sweden to try out for what must have been a kind of a mid-level, low-level soccer team, professional team, and he didn't make it. And he had a one-way ticket to Sweden, and he can't get back. So I've been in touch with a couple of his old mentors, and we're trying to figure out, how do we get him back? Should we get him back right now, or should we make him understand that these kinds of decisions have consequences, and you can't expect to be bailed out by people who have other obligations?
Well,
so
Sweden is
it's
very
complicated.
nice.
Well, I don't know about Sweden in February. I've been there before, but not in February. And he's 10 hours north of Stockholm, so I suspect it's not what a refugee from the Congo is used to.
No, of course not. But neither was Clarkston.
That's a good point. Yeah.
It's funny that you speak of him trying out for a maybe third, not Premier League, maybe not second league, but anyway, a soccer league, and it never had occurred to me all these years that had any of those boys become soccer players.
Well, some of them play at the college level.
Yeah, sure.
But soccer became a sort of, probably a lot like basketball or football to many a impoverished young person a way out.
Yeah.
And no one quite advertises up front that the pipeline narrows considerably.
Right.
Millions of kids around the world want to be professional soccer players, and only a very small handful ever make it.
Yeah.
And that's why education is obviously the most important thing, which is one of the messages of Outcasts.
Absolutely.
And you see it every day with these kids.
We started off partly by saying that you may be one of the youngest winners of the Kaysen Award. But you are, in fact, old enough to have been, you went up to Columbia to school and then worked in New York. Before you wrote your two books, you were a hard-working journalist with the New York Observer and the New York Times, and working wherever you could sell a story.
Right.
One of the things that I don't have a nostalgia for this because I wasn't there, but in the same way that I wish I had been in Paris in 1922, I wish I had been in New York at Plimpton's house. I wish I had been at the White Horse Tavern in the 50s and 60s and beyond, apparently. You saw the last chapter of the great New York literary scene.
It's true.
What was it like?
It's true. I got there right. I got there in the early '90s, right as a kind of a great era was. Maybe it was the sunset was coming, but it was still happening.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid at the New York Observer, and we closed our Tuesday night, the weekly edition on Tuesday night at the old townhouse at 5464th Street, between Park and Madison, a sort of incongruous place for a media publication in this Tony Upper East Side townhouse. We would pile out of the place and get in a cab, 4 or 5 of us squeezing in, annoying the driver who's only supposed to take 4 passengers, and we'd go over to George Plimpton's house for someone's book party, and it was just a thing you did. You never needed an invitation. And I remember seeing Kurt Vonnegut there, Gay Talese, Norman Mailer, all the icons that had driven my romanticization of
Yes.
New York to begin with.
Yeah.
These were the people who I kind of went to get near, and there they were. And I feel really lucky that I saw that up close. It was real. These are real people. They were actually, I guess the thing that took me aback about all of those people, whether it's Gay Talese or Tom Wolfe or Plimpton himself, despite the fact that they have this stature, they were all so incredibly kind to young writers and supportive. Gay Talese and Tom Wolfe both gave me blurbs for Rammer. I pretty much stalked them. It's what you do, and they appreciated it on some level, I guess, or they would have told me to buzz off. But I was very lucky to see that up close, and it was gratifying to feel like, wow, I'm here. Of course, now all the writers live in Brooklyn. There are no writers left in Manhattan. I live in Manhattan, but I walk around, I just bump into lawyers and bankers all day.
I wonder, I mean, maybe you can tell me this, but my feeling is that those the salon, the literary center, the if you want to be a writer, you go to the city. And my feeling is that it's not happening anymore. That writers are now just spread out everywhere. Where is the place today that would have been Dumago in 1922, or Plimpton's house
or Elaine's, probably some bar in Brooklyn I don't know of. I mean, I think a lot of there's definitely a scene. It's now a sort of a hybrid between the old literary scene and the tech scene, because it's this sort of crossover of it's this place in digital media where these things meet. And so there are lots of young, exciting, super talented people in New York doing really great things. But it's just not really, they're not conventional hardcover publishing novelists. They're exciting online writers and columnists and personalities who sort of flip from one medium to the next, and you know them and see them at cocktail parties. And so there is an excitement now, it's just a different one.
But there are parties. There
Sure.
are places, rooms in which people physically gather. They don't just send everything in.
Mostly it's Twitter.
Well,
but sometimes people sometimes people will put their screens down briefly to have an actual human conversation. But I've been to parties where I look around and think, wow, what an amazing group of people, and everyone's looking in their phones.
well, that's a shame. At the White Horse Tavern, that's not what happened.
That's true. If you went there now, you'd probably see a lot of people at the bar looking at their smartphones.
I thought for a while it was going to be Prague. I thought the center of the literary world was going to move to Prague after 1989. And for a few months, people talked about it. And then it just apparently went away. Right. Online, you've done a lot of work. Well, actually, before we leave the kind of New York scene, you worked with some wonderfully colorful and important people at the Observer, at the New Yorker, at the New York Times. You mentioned Gay Talese, but when you were, who was your editor at the Observer?
Well, the editor-in-chief of the New York Observer for most of the time that I was there was Peter Kaplan, who was just really one of the greats, an eccentric, brilliant, creative, amazing man who had a really special quality that I've only seen in a handful of editors in my life. And that was this sort of knack for convincing you that the story that you were working on was even bigger and more important than you imagine yourself.
Oh,
and
good.
He had a way of framing everything within the context of a grand story. So I wrote the media column at the Observer, and I remember one night being completely tongue-tied writing a profile of Geraldo Rivera during the Lewinsky scandal era. And he had sort of bombed with the failed opening of the Al Capone vault, and now he was back, and he was on TV every night covering Lewinsky. And so it was a story about a guy's sort of resurrection through a media scandal. And I was a kid, I really didn't have a lot to say about it. I hadn't seen enough of the arc of careers crashing and resurrecting to understand what was happening. And I went into Kaplan's office on Monday night at 9 o'clock, and we were all still at the office. And he told me I was writing a chapter in the great ongoing novel of the life of American media. And he talked about, he just took me through the whole, the pantheon of great media mockers, and inspired me enough that by the time it was done, I was ready to rip the door off the hinges, and I went and I just threw this piece down. I actually thought it was important, and I don't know if it was important or not. I haven't ever looked at that story since then, but I know that the feeling he gave me was that it was important, and that's a special gift that an editor can
That's what really matters.
Give a writer. Yeah.
My vote is that nothing about Geraldo Rivera is important. So
maybe, and
there you have it.
No more than any of us. I mean, he's just a guy trying to make it, I guess, and that was the story. You know, he was just a guy taking advantage of an opportunity that came his way and making the most of it.
Yeah.
So Kaplan was one of the greats. And actually, there was an Alabama connection here. Kaplan, who was the ultimate New Yorker in a way, came down to Alabama with Bobby Kennedy, his Harvard roommate, and spent a lot of time around Alex City and Montgomery, and was involved with the interviewing members of the civil rights movement. So we connected a bit over that. But I also worked with, when I was at the New Yorker writing for Tina Brown, Joseph Mitchell was still in the building.
How old was he then? 80?
He was old. He was old, but he showed up every day. And of course, he hadn't published a story in, I don't know, at that point, 30 some odd years, I think. But there was the author of Up in the Old Hotel and all those amazing stories that.
Well, they came out in a big collection.
That's right.
And shortly after that.
Yes, and he was a voice of New York that, you know, as a young writer, I think I internalized. I mean, to me, he was a throwback to you can hear Melville in Joseph Mitchell. He's very clearly the cadences, the sound of the sentences, the interplay of sort of short sentences with longer poetic looping sentences. To my ear, sound very like Melvillian, and I saw a lot of young New Yorker writers sort of adopting that tone, and so I thought, well, I'll do that too in these Talk of the Town pieces. So I tried to channel that spirit for a while, and I guess that's how you learn writing to some degree. You imitate people you admire until there's so many of them that you lose track of who's who, and you're now a mashup of all those voices that you admired.
And you were imitating the right people too. You had the right voices in your head, and that matters.
People I could connect with emotionally, and I guess what I really loved about Mitchell was his ability to elevate and sort of ennoble the life of everyday people, and that's something that I tried to do in Rammer and Jammer. This was a story about something that a lot of people would consider somewhat mundane. People who drive RVs to football games, so what? But there's the interior of that, when you get under the hood of the psychologies of these people and connect with them and try to understand them, you kind of, what I found was something, to my ear, like really, really sort of beautiful.
There's a lot of stories there. You left the Times a while back.
That's right.
And you're working with an online journalism project called Patch.
That's right.
Can you tell me and anyone watching what Patch is?
Sure. So I left the Times to go finish my second book, Outcasts, and I was going to go back to the paper, and somewhat happily, I love the Times. Felt very fortunate to be there. It's an incredible place to write for, and some of the most talented editors, journalists you could imagine being around. But the book started to get this sort of life on its own, where I was hearing from colleges who wanted to assign it to their entire freshman class, and the only catch was I had to show up to talk to them. And enough of these were sort of happening, and I kind of faced a decision: do I sort of double down and support this book that I'd poured a few years of my life into, or do I say no to all that and then just go back to the paper? And I chose the former because it seemed less certain. I knew if I went back to the paper, I could sort of see how that would play out, because I saw the trajectory and I saw the various options available to reporters within the institution. I had no idea what was going to happen if I tried to nourish this book along, and I didn't even know how it was going to work. And to me, that's always a more interesting option.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I got my wife to go along. We had a conversation one afternoon, and I think it was July. We were in a pool, and I just said, I have this crazy idea. Maybe I'm not going to go back to the paper. Maybe I'm going to try to help this book along. And I'm very lucky because she said, if that's what you believe, I'm behind you. So Patch came along later, and Patch is, it was an old AOL property, and the ambition of Patch was to put hyperlocal journalism in every community in America and to extend the kind of metropolitan coverage we're all used to down to the local level. So in Alabama, you would have a Mountain Brook Patch, or you'd have a South Side of Birmingham Patch.
Is a Patch a human being?
Patch.
I mean, in Mountain Brook, would it be a person?
A person, or one person, say, for Birmingham,
yeah,
covering Hoover, Vestavia, Mountain Brook, South Side.
And what does that person cover? What does that person
everything,
write about?
Everything. And that's what's everything and anything. And that's what's so kind of exciting about it from a journalistic perspective. You are a fully realized one-person media operation. And you pick your headlines, you pick your photos, you write your leads, you decide what to cover. And the idea is to give people this news that we all crave, what's happening around me. And the problem has never been with hyperlocal journalism. The problem has never been figuring out if people want it. We all know people want it because people crave it. They're constantly, the traffic on hyperlocal sites is very loyal, it's strong. The problem is just how do you make an economic model to support it.
Do you pay this reporter, this person I'm going to call a reporter, do you pay him?
We have 70 full-time staff reporters and then a number of contractors and freelancers.
Right.
But I was part of a turnaround team. So Patch was mainly famous under AOL for losing a lot of money because they never figured out how to make this thing work as a business. And that's our challenge. And I was sort of sitting on the sidelines a little bit of the digital revolution. I'd written about it a lot. I wrote for Wired. When I was at the style section at the Times, I was always writing about the way technology was changing society, whether it was online dating or sort of upstart blogs like Gawker and Gothamist, which I wrote about at the Times, I think before anybody else at the paper wrote about them. So I'd seen this change, and then I felt it. Between the book tour for Rammer Jammer and the book tour for Outcast United, the book columnist at pretty much every paper that I had spoken to along the way was let go.
Yes.
So, and a lot of the weeklies closed down. So when Outcast came out, we had this, I sort of shrugged my shoulders and said, well, who do I tell about this now? Whereas with Rammer, there had been this very set sort of circuit you did, and it was a very reliable way to tell the world about books. And that all went away. So I've seen the effects of the digital revolution on media, but I was never doing anything about it. I marketed both my books online and did a lot of work. I felt like I knew more than some of my colleagues at the paper, or less than a lot of others. But Patch is a way to kind of to try to get involved and see if I can make some contribution to figuring out some of the big questions of how to get an economic underpinning for this.
You have advertising, yes?
Sustainable.
There is advertising?
Absolutely, yeah. Right now it's almost 100%.
Is there subscription?
No, it's not.
So it's free to the user.
Correct.
But one hopes you'll have enough advertising to make it go.
That's right, and all media now faces pressure to diversify revenue sources because the cost of online advertising is going like this.
Well, one of the things that you've your books having come out at exactly the moments in time that they have come out, you have experienced and coped beautifully with the need for the author to be the marketer, to be the publicist, to be the promoter of his own book. I've talked lately to a number of older writers whose publicists and agents and so on have said, you have to start a blog. Right. You have to.
Well, how do I do that?
Tweet.
It's funny.
They don't want to do it.
I did that, and I found it really fun. And the reason it was fun is because it was hard. I had no idea how to do that. And one thing I've tried to impress upon a lot of young writers I've spoken to is that you have to be prepared for the fact that when you're an author, there are lots of stages to the process, and they almost have nothing to do with each other. So you're a journalist, you're writing, you're reporting, you're researching. Then you're a writer locked in your room trying to craft a narrative. Then you spend some period of time as a sort of a kind of planner, and you're going to launch a big product the way Apple might launch a product. It's just your book is the product, and you're the only person who can do anything about it. And then you have to go out in the world, and then you have to speak and talk to people and make friends and try to get people to believe in this thing that you've done. And it's amazing, like the range of skills required for each of those things have very little overlap. So I think it's really hard, but I loved it, and I love the challenge of it. And I remember telling a Times writer, someone had referred him to me and said, you know, Warren worked really hard on marketing his books. You should get his advice. So I sat down in Starbucks and I was telling him everything you can do. You know, if you go into Barnes & Noble, did you know that they'll give you a pamphlet with the phone number of every Barnes & Noble in America? And if you're going to that town, you can call them 3 weeks in advance and ask them to shortlist your book, because that's the internal Barnes & Noble lingo for ordering more copies. And then you go in and you sign them. I was working through all this stuff, and he just closed his notebook as I was talking. And I said, I'm sorry, is this not helpful? And he said, no, it's extremely helpful, because as you're describing all these things, I'm realizing I'm not the kind of person who will do any of this.
Oh.
And so I have to make my peace with my book finding its audience on its own or not. Right. And that is one of the questions you have to ask yourself as a writer.
Right.
Nobody owes you anything. Nobody owes you a sale or a read.
No.
And if you don't want to fight for it, that's okay, go write your next book.
Yeah.
But don't expect it to happen on its own.
You have done this amazingly successfully, because Outcast United has been adopted as a freshman read or in some other form for almost 100 colleges and universities. It's in now, I think, 7 languages besides English. And it has been the single city read for several places.
Yeah.
So whatever it is, however this is supposed to be done, you're doing fine. We have no seconds left. Are you writing another book?
I'm working on 2, and I'm going to just be cryptic because they're changing in front of me as I write them. But I'm writing my first novel, and it's a thriller set in Alabama.
Oh, good.
So stay tuned for that. And I'm working on a nonfiction book as well. It's also about disruption in a hidebound American industry.
Great.
So
Well,
I hope Alabama readers will stick around and wait.
Oh, you have loyal Alabama readers. And when it comes out, I'll be one of them.
Thanks so much.
It's so good to see you again, Warren.
Appreciate
Congratulations.
it. Love talking about books with you.